Hello and welcome to Brokenomics. And in this episode, I'm going to be looking at some big ideas. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at ARK Invest and their Big Ideas 2023 report. They put out, they've been doing this for a couple of years now. They've been putting out a report every year on big ideas that they think are going to change the future. So these are technology. So ARK is a fund based in the US who are investing in innovation, effectively. So long duration tech stocks, all that kind of stuff. So basically a lot of stuff which is technology focused, very much at the cutting edge, who don't have necessarily big revenues today, but could expand into something quite significant in the future. And they lay out the reasons for why they're doing this. Now, I don't necessarily agree with everything that's in this report, but it is a really interesting future look at what an economy might look like in a few years' time. And they paint a very optimistic case of where we could be in a few years' time. Obviously, there is going to be a darker side to some of these technologies, so we need to touch on that as we go through. But I do think it's interesting to cover the optimistic look of where we go from here. So this is the report, Big Ideas 2023, issued by ARK. And they identify in this 5 big themes split down into 14 different technologies that they think are going to fundamentally change the economy. So artificial intelligence, digital consumer, digital wallets, public blockchain, Bitcoin, smart contract networks, precision therapeutics, molecular diagnosis, electric vehicles, autonomous ride-hail, autonomous logistics, robotics and 3D printing, and orbital aerospace. And then the big thing is how these technologies converge together to give a sort of multiplicity to this. So let's get into this report. This is basically going to be a stream of consciousness and me reacting to this report and going through it. And then I think in future episodes of Brokenomics, I think it's worth coming back to some of these individual points and picking up on them. So these are the 5 big technological platforms that they're talking about, that the 14 individual technologies are focused within. So these are public blockchains. So this is effectively the digitization of value. And I've already done a Brokenomics on Bitcoin, but the blockchain thing as a whole is bigger than that. Bitcoin, I do think, is going to be the digitization of money, or at least it offers the possibility for the digitization of money and the separation of state from money. But public blockchains are potentially bigger than that. It is all value that could go onto that, and so I will come back to that one. Multinomic sequencing. So this is a lot of breakthroughs that are being made in applying technology to genomics for medical care. Now, of course, this one is going to be one of the prickliest ones because a big aspect of this is going to be mRNA based, so modifying the RNA. And of course, we have recently had we recently come out of a period of time where some aspects of these products have been pushed on the public rather aggressively by governments, which is very unfortunate, because what they did is they pushed out a technology long before it was ready for mainstream. But nevertheless, there are some interesting ideas to talk about in that one, but we will do that with a critical eye. Artificial intelligence, of course, everybody's talking about that at the moment. That's one of the first things I want to come back on. Now, artificial intelligence is so interesting because it impacts each of these areas, and it multiplies the effect that they can have. Energy storage. People on our side of the debate tend to be a bit suspicious of energy stuff because, of course, it tends to get talked about a lot by the yogurt weaving lentilists, and we're certainly not on their side. But nevertheless, there is an energy sort of technology revolution going on, which will be all to our benefit. So it is worth looking at the bits of this that make sense. And then robotics. So, I mean, that will include things like, literally robots, especially if you combine it with artificial intelligence, but also 3D printing and a lot of the breakthroughs in orbital infrastructure that is being built up at the moment. So those are the 3 big trends. And then they start off the report talking a lot about the convergence effects, about how if you combine these together, they become more powerful. And I think the most relevant slide here is going to be this one, where they are looking at the effect that these the sort of multiplier effect that these technologies can have, and by far and away the biggest one there is going to be neural networks, which touches pretty much everything. So if there is sufficient advance in AI, it will basically help accelerate pretty much all other technologies, especially these sort of high innovation ones, and it talks to the degree about it. So, there are other things in there that impact this convergence, but that is going to be the biggest one. So, an example of that is going to be how AI chatbots are helping to drive robo-taxis, because the neural nets that process language, so the chat GPT, that kind of thing, that kind of neural net processing is proving to be extremely helpful with robo-taxis, so self-driving cars, because you can apply the learnings from that to sort of how to navigate a complex intersection. So the benefits that are being made in one can be applied to other, and this is potentially leading to the speed up of this technology. So we are getting ever closer to fully realized self-driving cars. So the implications of that are quite significant, because driving is the world's largest profession for unskilled men in the world. So if you get to the point, and we probably will get there reasonably soon, of autonomous driving, then that's going to have a significant impact on the way that we look at the economy, and other impacts as well. And to be fair, we have unreliable self-driving cars at the moment. It is possible to get in a car somewhere in California and have your entire journey done with the car driving itself. I say California because it is a data-driven process, and Tesla are based in California, and they have the most data there, and therefore it is the most reliable there. And so it is possible to go from home to office with zero interventions. You just sit there in the car and let it drive. It's just at the moment you need to be there hovering over the steering wheel, ready to take control, because it is not at 100% yet, and you don't want to be in a moving vehicle on one of those occasions where it doesn't work quite right. But nevertheless, the point is the proportion of the time that you can go from A to B with zero interventions is going to rise until it becomes basically every time. So an important potential learning there. Then they talk about how AI can help some of the other technologies. I don't think we will stop with that too far. Let's dive into, this is another thing, how energy and Bitcoining can interact. So basically the logic here is, if you're installing a solar system, just the fact that you started that process means that you've got a sort of a bulk of cost. You've called people out who are doing the work, you're interacting, you're putting up the scaffolding, you're doing all of those things. It makes sense, if you're doing that, to put the largest array on if you can. But the problem is, if you do that, you basically surpass your needs for what you can actively use out of it. So one of the things they're talking about in terms of convergence, and this is again just an example, is you can basically use all of the excess generated from that to, for example, mine Bitcoin. I appreciate some of you might be unconvinced by Bitcoin at this time, but nevertheless there is a value there at the moment, even at the moment at these relatively suppressed levels. I mean, it never really went much lower than about $15,000 per Bitcoin. So there is value there, and if you can integrate Bitcoin mining into your solar setup so that you basically get the maximum size setup that you can beyond your needs, if you can monetize the rest of it, then you get a faster payback on your solar array setup, because there is some value there. And potentially I think that the Bitcoin could go significantly beyond where it is, and we'll be talking about that in this report as well. Okay, now this is the really significant bit. So this is why I really decided that this justified a Brokenomics episode. It talks on this slide about historic growth rates and how these innovation technologies could improve that growth rate. So it's giving the example there, for those of you who are listening. It shows a chart of the levels of economic growth that we have seen over humanity's history. And they actually go back quite far. And they're looking there at 100,000 years ago to the year 1. They're estimating that economic growth was something like 0.037%. So a tiny year-on-year improvement in economic growth. I mean, presumably that would have been Huff sharpening his spear slightly better and explaining that to the next guy and so on. So very small incremental improvements. And then from year 1 to year 1000, it was something like 0.14%. And then basically over time, this rises. And this really starts to get going in the 19th century, when the growth rate achieved about 3%. So from 1900 to present day, that growth rate of about 3% has been more or less consistent. Now, what happened in 1990? Well, that was a convergence of a number of technologies, which, when applied together, they had this sort of multiplicity effect on top of them. So they're going to be things like railways, electricity, and telephones, telecommunications, of a basic sort. Each one of those were a transformative, innovative technology. But when you combine them on top of each other, they have the effect of boosting economic growth. Because obviously, if you can communicate with people many miles away, it's much easier to run logistics. You can imagine, if you're selling anything, being able to get real-time sort of pricing information or knowing where to send things speeds up considerably with the telephone. The automobile and the railways, the other technologies that they had, radio, all of these things, when you combine them together, it allows that faster economic growth. So why do I think that this is a point worth making? Okay, so let's look at that 3% growth between 1990 and I'm just going to run it up to 2000, because I think after 2000 the magic money tree really starts to interfere with measurements of economic growth. But I want to give you a counterfactual. So let's say the US economy grew at that 3% over that 100-year period. Why is 3% a big deal? What if it was, say, 1.5%? If the US had grown 1.5% on average every year between the year 1900 and the year 2000, what difference would that actually make? Because you might think, well, only 1.5% to 3%. Does that really make so much difference? It does. Actually, if the US had grown at that rate over that time period, the US economy would today be smaller than the economy of Brazil, which is quite a surprising outcome. And in fact, because the US has a larger population than Brazil, I think Brazil has got something like 200 million people, whereas the US is about 350 million people. The per capita GDP of the US wouldn't even be at Brazil's level. It would be at Botswana's level, of about $6,500 per person. I mean, obviously, it wouldn't be dollars if the US had that sort of economic growth, because it wouldn't be operating the dollar system. But you get where I'm going from as a basis of comparison. So a greater economic rate makes a huge difference. Now, what ARC are talking about in this report, they go on to make the case that they think that by 2030, if these technologies are properly exploited, the growth rate could increase to 6.1%. So let's run the counterfactual now. What would have happened to the US economy if it had grown at 6.1% over the last 100 years as opposed to the 3% that it did? Well, the answer is that the economy would be 20 times larger than it is today. So, if you go from 3% to 6%, it's not like the economy would be twice as large as it is today. It has that multiplying effect, that cumulative increase. And so if that were the case, the US would currently have an economy which is bigger than the rest of the world put together. And it gets really crazy, because ARC are saying that they feel that by 2040, the growth rate that we could be seeing would be 10.7%. And that is absolutely nuts. I'll tell you why. Let's look at the counterfactual again. What would have happened if the US economy had grown over the last 100 years by 10.7% instead of the 3% that it actually had? Well, the answer might surprise you. Their economy would be over 1,000 times larger than it is today. So what looks like a relatively small increase, going from 3% to 6% to 10%, you put that over a long period of time, and it has absolutely phenomenal differences to the level of economic outcome, the level of wealth that you have in your economy. And we are talking about real economic growth here. We're not talking about magic money tree type stuff where just more money is printed and the denominator goes down. This is real growth, where you're stripping out that effect of the extra money that goes in. So this is hugely important. This is potentially hugely optimistic, and put it in perspective, because of the things we've already talked about on Brokenomics. We've already talked about how we are basically in a debt spiral because Western governments have overspent. The debt has become completely excessive. If we grow at 3% going forward, then we are we are trapped in that debt spiral situation, and there's no pulling out of that because the debt will be growing faster than that rate, and therefore basically the whole system wipes itself out, or we, the most developed countries end up looking like Venezuela, where you're eating your pets because the debt consumes all, the whole system collapses, and we get something new out of it. If we were to achieve 6.1%, that's just on the other side of the debt spiral. So we need to achieve something like 6.1% coming out of this, just for the Western civilization to survive effectively. So that 6.1% would bail us out of our problems, which is, it is in some sense frustrating that the people who've done very well out of this system wouldn't get their comeuppance, but it is better than the alternative, which would be a messy collapse. And if we do achieve 10.7% by 2040, as long as we can stop Western governments from basically spending all of that and more, which is their tendency to do so, that would be a very bright future for all of us. You can sort of envisage spending your old age being doted over by robot butlers and that sort of thing. So tremendous if true. Let's get into the report to find out what we think of their arguments as we go through this. Another very important point that they make early on in this presentation is that these sort of disruptive technologies, they complicate how you measure economic statistics. So you will remember in Brokenomics 1, that was one of the first things I started talking about, is the nature of the economy has changed. And I gave the example of Blockbuster to Netflix. So Blockbuster was operating on the old economic model, which is more, another store, another employee, more capital expansion. And they were destroyed by Netflix coming along and saying, we're going to reduce the marginal cost of video distribution down to zero. And it broke that model, and suddenly all those stores and staff became a liability rather than an asset. And that is just one example out of many cases as to how the economy has shifted from a capital expansion model to a cost efficiency model. And that's really difficult for our the way that the way we think about economics at the moment. So they give the example here of, say, this is I can't personally relate to this, but this is the US system. Apparently, is they have cable TV packages that can cost them over $100, and by going on to streaming things, even if you take all of the streaming options, they've got here Prime, Apple, HBO, Netflix, ESPN, Disney, and Hulu. Even if you take all of those, you're getting a saving of about 40% on your TV bill. So you're getting a lot more, but the cost of it is going down. So in standard economic terms, that is the economy shrinking, but you're getting more. And so that's where our current financial system is going to struggle against the increasing drive to technological solutions which focused on cost minimization. And it really goes to show why the current monetary system has to be replaced, because at the moment our entire system is based on taking out more and more loans, creating more interest payments, and needing that continual monetary expansion in order for this whole system to function. So the government-backed fiat currencies are simply going to be, well, they're incompatible now, I think, and that was the case that I made in Brokenomics 1, but it's going to become increasingly obvious that they are incompatible with how the economy works now, and that is going to become increasingly true. They've also got the example of electric vehicles versus standard vehicles. The costs of electric vehicles are coming down, and we cover that more in this report as well. But also the annual operating costs are significantly lower. But again, you're getting more for less, which again looks bad on economic statistics, but it's actually to your benefit. I mean, it's certainly bad for the banks because they don't operate on that model. Okay, so this slide is interesting. They start to look at how the boost in the economy might come about and how the technologies might form into that. So they're basically looking at what the consensus forecast on the existing model is. So the consensus forecast, I mean, presumably this is for the US, but they're looking at, or could this be world? No, this is probably going to be world GDP. So they're looking at a level of about 130 trillion by 2030 is the sort of consensus model based on the economic thinking that we have at the moment, and they're saying that they think it will be significantly higher, and they set out a series of technologies that will make that difference. So they think that the economy could be 26 trillion larger as a result of the energy technology, 16 trillion larger as a result of robotics. And that will take us up to 170 trillion world economy. Now, all that gets you back to is the historic rate of growth. So that standard 3% that we enjoyed over the last 100 years, which we no longer think we're going to get because we are so bound down by regulation, by debt, and all the things that is really compressing economic growth rates at the moment. They're making the argument, well, actually, to get it back up to trend level, you just need to adopt those two technologies, and those two technologies alone will be sufficient in order to get us back on trend. And then they go on to talk about the other things. The biggest one by far is going to be AI, and that could, they think, lead to an additional 140 trillion in world economic output, which is, if true, is substantial. So let's continue. Another thing they think, because they are investors, so this is a fund that's doing this. ARC is a fund who invest in stocks in technology companies. They're making the argument that by 2030, the majority of the stock market will be dominated by these innovation technologies. Now that makes perfect sense to me. Actually, I'm inclined to agree with this one, because if you look at, say, the stock market today compared to 20 years ago, the stock market today is, it's dominated by internet firms. So the internet is a relatively new technology. It didn't really start to see mainstream adoption until around about 2000, maybe a bit before that. It was very niche before that. And if you look at who are the biggest players in the stock market today, it's companies like Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Netflix. All of these are sort of internet companies, and in a very short space of time, over 20 years, those companies have come to dominate the share of the US stock market. Well, world stock markets as well, because the US makes up such a large proportion of this. And their projection is that you roll forward another 10 years and basically the same thing will happen, except rather than it being internet stocks, it's going to be, AI stocks, energy stocks, robotic stocks, and so on. And that when you sort of add these things up together, actually, what are they saying? I think it's something like... about 2/3 of the market is going to be these new innovation stocks, which is why they're positioning themselves on this. And going by what we have seen in the last 20 years with internet stock, that seems reasonable. So the first thing they dive into is artificial intelligence. They're talking here about how 2022 was the year of generative AI and the process of this. Now, since this report has come out, of course, we've seen a couple of iterations of ChatGPT, and now everybody is talking about this to a much larger extent. And the key concept that they're using in this is the cost declines that you get in these technologies. So, for example, what they're saying here is, in order to get what do they put it? A graphic design job, so what would take a human 5 hours to do. So that sounds reasonable for a graphic designer to work on a project and get a good result. The cost is $150 for that. And AI is able to do that, and it takes the time to do it down from 5 hours to less than a minute, and it takes the cost down from $150 to 8 cents. Now, this is the key thing in all technologies: is the ability to substantially improve the speed at which things are done and the cost that it takes to do them. We've seen this with all technology. That's railways. It was the same thing. It was to move large volumes of goods around taking it off the wagons and putting it on a steam train meant it got there significantly faster, and it was significantly cheaper as well. And that applies to we are entering the phase of digitalization of creative output, and the same thing is going to apply there. And it also leads to a substantial increase in the amount of that happens. And the other side of the cost equation is the cost to train this or to develop this technology. So this is a slide here where they're talking about the cost to train an AI, and they're saying that in 2020, in order to train a model such as ChatGPT-3, it cost 4.6 million in order to train that model. And just 2 years later, the cost to train something at the standard of ChatGPT-3, I know we passed beyond that now with version 4, and possibly by the time you watch this video there'll be another version out, but the cost has fallen tenfold from 4.6 million to 450,000. And they're predicting that in order to train a model of that standard by 2030 will cost $30. So the cost to generate a functional AI is going to be decreasing very significantly over time, which will lead us to the point where, at the moment you've got a very small number of organizations who have the resources to build an AI model. And then what you're going to happen is going to get down to the point of corporations are going to be able to have their own AI model and train it on their own data. And by the end of the decade, you will be able to have your own AI model and train it on your data. So it will be beholden to you. The problem is, of course, is that it's the version that you have is going to be a couple of generations behind the cutting edge of what perhaps a corporation or a centralized service might offer, and so you might be inclined to use one of those as instead because it offers more better output for you. But the point is that this will become available to more and more people over time, so that everybody will be adopting it. The other thing they look at is the hardware costs that sit behind a lot of AI, and that is falling at a 70% annual rate per year. So again, making it significantly more accessible. So when you combine the cost to train the model, the cost to run the compute in the background, what you're going to see is an absolute explosion of AI use for pretty much everything. It then leads on to the problem that this AI is creating a huge demand for data, because we talked about how the cost of the AI itself will fall, the cost of the compute that it runs on will fall. So the scarce element at that point is going to be the data. So data is the new oil, effectively. That's the scarce thing, because the more data you can feed into these, the better the model you have. And effectively, this is where you sort of get into the flywheel thing. So whoever is able to harvest the most data is going to have the best model, because it's been trained on a larger subset and is therefore more useful.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.